welcome to Economics Unbound. I'm Tandeka Gubule, and before we get started, let's just talk about, joining us to take the conversations that we have on Economics Unbound further on our social media platform. It's at Economics Unbound on Facebook. So today, let me tell you, we tackle the big D word and ask the question again. Are we sinking into a kind of economic depression caused by COVID-19? As lockdowns around the world have decimated economic performance and signs of a depression abound, and economists have begun to ask and speak of the possibility that we are sinking into a depressive state, quite a bit like that experienced by the world in 1920, when global GDP dropped by 10.6% in 1931.
In economics, a depression is a severe and prolonged downturn in economic activity. It is an extreme recession lasting longer than 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. A depression and its scarring and debilitating chronic effects last for years. Real declines in GDP stand at 10% and above. This makes recessions much more common. Globally, since 1854, there have been 33 recessions and just one Great Depression.
And the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 did affect South Africa, especially our agricultural sector. The COVID-19 pandemic is sinking the South African economy into a depression, as Business for South Africa and other forecasters indicate that GDP may fall a further 17% or as far as 17%. Treasury is now toying with scenarios that indicate that we may contract perhaps between 6.5% and 16% and lose 7 million jobs in the process. That's misery right there. Previously, single-digit projections of GDP decline are fast receding as more dire calculations and a sea of business failures in South Africa and abroad cause citizens around the world to queue in food lines and unemployment lines as businesses fall to their knees and surrender to liquidations and business rescue processes.
Taking stock of major collapses in the companies in the service sector of South Africa's economy, we ask the question, are we sinking into a Great Depression? A depression is characterized as a dramatic downturn in economic activity in conjunction with a sharp fall in growth, employment, and production. Depressions also involve a collapse of consumer confidence indicators, a severe decrease in investments, substantial increases in unemployment, bankruptcies of companies, a bearish stock market environment, a falling currency, and a shutdown in major sectors of the economy.
Now, economic activity in the world economy has been greatly hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic, including ourselves here at home. The last time the world saw such limited economic activity was in the late 1920s, as I've said before, the time of the Great Depression. But what exactly is a depression, and at what point do we look at the current state of the global economy and make the associations? Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with some definitions and numbers from my colleague, Arabile Gumede.
This is what a depression is. It is an economic, according to the economic definition anyway, it is, according to Oxford Dictionary, it is a period when there is little economic activity and many people are poor or without jobs. The Cambridge Dictionary calls it a period in which there is very little business activity and not many jobs. So clearly both offer a similar definition and tells you then what an economic depression is. Now, the world has seen many depressions, but there's only been one major Great Depression. So what is it exactly? What is a Great Depression? What was the Great Depression? Well, it was the period in which we saw the decrease in wealth, industrial production, and employment from 1929 until the start of the Second World War. That's according to Cambridge. So again, it tells you the story of what exactly that meant. We lost out on industrial production, lost out on jobs, and as you can see, the wealth and economy went into disrepute. So we will then ask ourselves what exactly happened during that Great Depression to bring all these things about. What did the economy of the United States then look like? So, number one, the Great Depression began in the United States when the New York Stock Exchange fell then, back in 1929. That day famously known as Black Tuesday. It was led by declines then in purchases of houses and cars because consumers were burdened by a whole host of debt. So that led that decline there. On the stock market front, well, the Dow Jones Industrial fell 12%, while the market lost $30 billion of value in just 2 days. Many businesses and banks failed, and millions of people even lost their jobs at that time, which then meant that unemployment spiked in the United States to 25% at its highest level during that Great Depression. If any of that sounds familiar, well, it is somewhat. This is what South Africa looks like now in this time of COVID-19. The JSE All Share has fallen 20% from its peak. Its peak was only recognized or recorded in the first quarter of 2018. At that point, the All Share had actually reached more than 61,000 points. It is currently down 14% at least this year. Now, the local currency has also fallen over 30% since the start of the year. The big questions have been around growth, and expectations are that the economy could then contract as much as 23.2%. And that's according to Business for South Africa. And that is their worst case scenario. Around 16.8% contraction in growth or so in their medium case scenario. And it's still, the economy could fall over 10% in the best case scenario, according to Business for South Africa. But according to National Treasury, we could also see unemployment spike. But that number could spike to 50%. We're currently sitting at around 29. That could rise to 50% unemployment because we could see as many as 7 million people lose their jobs due to the coronavirus pandemic, according to Finance Minister Tito Mbowene's office. Now, the manufacturing sector was also at an almost standstill in the month of April. We saw vehicle sales absolutely decimated. A clear example of that. It fell 98.4% in April. So the manufacture and sale of vehicles was almost non-existent in the month of April. Vehicle manufacturing is one of the biggest manufacturing sectors in South Africa. The likes of Comair clearly telling you as well that, well, they're going to be under business rescue. SAA may no longer exist in its current form. SA Express is also under temporary liquidation. So that sector is certainly taking a hit. The services sector has also been wiped out with a massive slowing, if not elimination, of community services, social services, distribution services had stopped for some time, business services had to be halted in some respects, the financial services sector had to change the way it did business, and transport services also completely altered as well. So those are the facts and predictions. And although we don't have all the precise data, which would be very historic nonetheless, is this enough evidence then for us to be able to say that South Africa has perhaps already entered into its own Great Depression? You decide.
Thank you, Arabile, for making us really focus the mind and think about where we are as a country. Two reports that are swirling around in National Treasury and in government circles paint a bleak picture of our fortunes. By the time the Minister of Finance takes to the podium to deliver his emergency supplementary budget in Parliament to reprioritize the nation's spending, the economy will have contracted so deeply that the models that he was perhaps working on with his department may be outdated as his February 2020 budget speech, perhaps.
Tans, before we go into a list of some companies that have collapsed, let us listen to our colleague Gloria Sifago-Musi as she tells the story of what a depression actually is and how it differs from a recession.
The South African economy might go into depression if current conditions don't improve. The economy was already in recession before COVID-19 outbreak. Business for South Africa says the economy could contract by between 10 to 16.7% this year. Despite stimulus packages that were announced by government, the organization says that as many as 4 million jobs are at risk. There are some people who say there are more jobs at risk. For example, Treasury, as we've said that 7 million jobs may be at risk. Gloria Sefago-Musi has the details.
This is possibly the highest tide the world economy has ever seen, and South Africa has not escaped the bruises of its own economic meltdown. Supply chains have been disrupted and trade came to an almost standstill. Many companies were forced to shut their doors as governments around the globe tried to cap the spread of the coronavirus. Some economists say recovery is not in sight at the moment, but rather a depression, which is a severe and prolonged downturn in economic activity, is likely. Economic depression is defined as recessions lasting longer than 3 years or resulting in a drop in annual GDP of at least 10%. Some companies are not expected to be able to open their doors when the lockdown period finally comes to an end. They will go down with hundreds of thousands of jobs and the much-needed tax revenue.
There is no technical definition for a depression, but the economy will definitely show elements of a depression with big unemployment numbers, large growth in unemployment, and many businesses going into bankruptcy.
Many will lose their jobs. Some expect unemployment to be as high as 40%.
We're looking in the short term at a 40% unemployment level, with the risk being that it could be higher. And when it comes to the youth, the 15 to 25-year-olds, I think that this number is going to be somewhere around 70, maybe 80%. It's going to be massive because there are no new opportunities. There are no new opportunities for kids just out of school education or training to find a new job.
The higher unemployment will present more pressure on the already strained government finances as more people will require assistance. Gloria Sefago-Musi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
South African Airways is the state-owned flag carrier airline of South Africa. Headquartered in Airways Park at OR Tambo International Airport, the airline operates a hub-and-spoke network, linking over 40 local and international destinations across Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, South America, and Oceania from its base in Johannesburg, using a fleet of more than 40 aircrafts. The carrier joined Star Alliance in April 2006, the first African carrier to sign with one of 3 airline alliances. SAA has been our flag flyer and our national carrier since I can remember. SAA is now no more. It was ailing but was pushed over by a weak business model, a long-term hedging crisis, rampant looting and corruption, followed by a crippling strike and the COVID-19 restrictions on travel.
Judgment has been reserved in the labour court matter between unions and the business practitioners for South African Airways, so Nana is not quite over yet. The National Union of Metal Workers, NUMSA, and the South African Cabin Crew Association asked the court to declare unlawful the retrenchment process underway at the airline. The business rescue practitioners are arguing that layoffs can go ahead without the completion of a business plan, while NUMSA argues that its application on the back of the business rescue practitioners' failure to deliver a plan for the airline.
The labour unions approached the court on an urgent basis, asking for the court to block the retrenchments at the troubled national carrier. The workers say the retrenchment process that started in March is unlawful because there is no business plan. The labour unions also say the retrenchments fall outside of the practitioners' mandate of developing a business rescue plan. The union accuses the business practitioners of taking decisions that are not in the interest of both the airline or the workers.
In our application, we make it very clear that in terms of the Companies Act, they cannot take any decisive steps in relation to restructuring. They cannot negotiate packages, retrenchment packages, when they don't have a plan to guide them. So we've made the application today. Our attorneys presented our argument before the judge today Judgment in the case was reserved. We hope that the decision will be handed down quite soon. We understand that the court does take cognizance of the fact that the clock is ticking and we need a decision soon. So we are expecting a decision as soon as possible.
The business rescue practitioners have blamed government for failing to support them. They say they were left with two options to save SAA. The one option is to go ahead with the business rescue plan to avoid liquidation if an agreement could be reached with the SAA employees. And the other is to make an urgent application to discontinue the business rescue proceedings if they fail to reach an agreement and place SAA into liquidation. Judgment will be delivered to both parties via email. Gloria Sefakomusi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Local and international aviation and tourism bodies are appealing for $10 billion from global financial institutions to save their own institutions. This as concerns rise that many businesses won't survive the effects of COVID-19 on them. The International Air Transport Association, the UN Tourism Organization, the World Travel and Tourism Council, the African Airlines Association, and the Airlines Association of Southern Africa say without urgent funding, the COVID-19 crisis could see a total collapse of the sector in Africa. Hello, Chris.
Application for voluntary business rescue further shows the strain the aviation industry is under. The owner of Kulula.com and the local operator for British Airways Airlines says its decision is to safeguard the interests of the company, and it comes as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, which has disrupted the implementation of a turnaround plan. The latest at Comair comes hot on the heels of a crisis at South African Airways, whose future is uncertain. Aviation experts say the sector urgently needs government support to prevent more companies from going under.
It's really tragic at the moment that there are going to be jobs lost in this sector. You know, just to put things into perspective, in South Africa at the moment, as a direct result of the COVID-19 crisis, we're going to see 14.5 million fewer passenger journeys taking place in the country this year. That's a loss of about $3 billion US dollars in revenue for the airlines in the country. And at risk are about 252,000 jobs across the air transport and tourism sector. And together they represent about $5 billion US dollars in contribution to our economy. So the stakes are very high, and really government needs to start coming to the party now.
A recent global data survey shows that consumer uncertainty is one of the greatest barriers facing the travel industry. According to the data, 70% of South African respondents say they're still extremely concerned about the impact of COVID-19. 74% believe that conditions will worsen over the next 6 months. Meanwhile, gaming company Phumelela has hinted going the voluntary liquidation route as well. On Monday, it issued interim financial results for the 6 months ended 31st January 2020, where it lost a combined 115.1 million rands. It says betting turnovers remain under pressure in the country, where at least 40,000 jobs are at risk. Phumelela says horse racing requires a national reorganization, as the current funding model no longer functions in the best long-term interests of the industry. A number of other industries are bracing for the worst due to the pandemic. The car manufacturing industry says before the COVID-19 crisis, government had crafted a plan to supercharge the sector to help revive the struggling local economy. But the sector too has been brought to its knees. So is the construction sector, that is expected to be catastrophic in impact, with estimates that up to 140,000 formal jobs could be lost as activity levels nosedive. Diabosito, SABC News, Johannesburg.
And for more on the aviation sector, we are now joined by Chris Zwigenthal. He's the CEO of the Airlines Association of South Africa. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Tandeka. Thank you, and good evening to everybody.
Now, Chris, your industry was the first to show signs of severe distress.
Yes. Look, immediately when the COVID-19 started appearing in other countries, obviously first coming from China, the first steps that all the states made was to effectively stop air travel. and so it was quite a big blow to the industry. And from a perspective of from about a 100% type of operation in February, it went down to 40% in South Africa, down to zero overnight when the president announced the lockdown on the night of the 26th of March 2020. So effectively, the entire industry is pretty much in lockdown and is deriving absolutely no revenue whatsoever. And throughout Africa, in fact, 47, my understanding is that 47 out of the 54 states are in lockdown. So there is absolutely very little traveling taking place. At least 95% of the flights have been grounded. And there's actually in South Africa, as you're aware, there's only special flights, repatriation flights or cargo flights and emergency flights that are allowed to take place.
And Chris, is your association joining hands and forces with the international call for state assistance?
Yes, look, we certainly have followed the lead of IATA, who have sent notes to many governments around the world, and they've sent a note to our government in South Africa requesting aid. We joined their initiative, which you just read out at the beginning of your sector, as one of the signatories to request financial institutions throughout Africa and around the world to assist African aviation in terms of trying to prevent a collapse of the industry throughout the continent. And in South Africa, we've also made approaches on behalf of the South African airline industry, as other states have done around in the region and around the world, to ask their states for support of their industry in many possible fashions, either through reduction or deferment of charges and taxes, soft loans of some nature, low interest loans, as well as a possible cash injection if from a liquidity basis, if there are liquidity-based problems, which we certainly know that there are within our industry.
Our main carrier in the country was ailing even before COVID-19. So
Yes.
This must have just been, the plague coming to just wipe it out, and as it was on its last leg. What were the problems that were unique to our main carrier in South Africa before the virus?
I think the journey that South African Airways has had has been a long journey, and I think everybody is very aware of the situation. It went through a very tough time. I think it's had a situation where it hasn't made a profit in just about 10 years. And that's obviously a number of factors which I think are very well recorded in the media and in the records. Obviously, having a real problem with leadership and just getting a clear-cut strategy and business plan to be able to put them on the right track. Cost base very difficult and quite a high cost base, and therefore not able to really cover costs and all that they're incurring. So obviously, when you have COVID-19 come in, it's totally exacerbated the situation for South African Airways, where they were on the road with the business rescue process. We were all awaiting a plan, and obviously the situation with COVID-19 has delayed that, and the business rescue practitioners have requested delays on numerous occasions. And I think that the problem that the South African Airways is now incurring is exactly the same. Well, it's been exacerbated, as I mentioned, but it's the same problem that's been experienced by all the domestic carriers or the South African-based carriers operating in South Africa. There's a total of 8 airlines that we represent on our scheduled airlines within South Africa, and they're all going through a cash crisis. At the beginning of the lockdown, you could say that they had about 2 months of cash available. So effectively, from the beginning of lockdown until about the end of May, beginning of June, as you could say, that effectively the cash would have is drying up. And then what the airlines have now been doing is obviously taking actions such as putting people on unpaid leave. There have been some layoffs, there's a reduction of staff, and many other initiatives to try and preserve their cash and let things last as long as possible, so that when we get the go-ahead to start flying again, that they'll be in a position to restart operations and provide the service that the passenger is looking for.
And Chris, what do you think of the talk in government circles of South African Airways rising again in a new form, like a phoenix out of the ashes?
No, it's an interesting one. I don't know very much about the detail. I did listen to Minister Gordon speaking last night on television. And I mean, clearly, there appears to be disconnect between business rescue practitioners and the minister and the shareholder, I put it this way. And one really trusts that they do resolve their issues and find a solution. I mean, clearly, I think what the minister has said is he doesn't see South African Airways surviving in its current form, and that something new has to arise. I think that effectively they're going to have to look for solutions. They're going to have to look for funding. They're going to have to look for investors to be able to put money back into the airline or to start up a new airline. The concerns, of course, people have is there's an existing airline with a lot of creditors that are sitting there, including passengers and airlines that are owed money. And I think that this is a challenge that the government has got. That does obviously need to try and address that and find some way of taking those into account when they look at the new structure for a new airline, if that is possible.
Thank you very much. Chris is the Airlines Association of South Africa's chief executive. Now, Gold Reef City is one of Johannesburg's top tourist attractions, and it had to close down due to the national lockdown. That has now left Sokosan with high debt covenants, and reducing it will be a priority when trading resumes.
The once buzzing with life and movement, Gold Reef City Theme Park Hotel and Conference Center is now dead quiet with no movement in sight. Like most industries in South Africa, this sector is also closed down due to the national lockdown. The negative effect of the lockdown has compromised Sokosan's financial standing. The company, like 1,000 others, had to comply when the president announced measures to curb COVID-19. All Sokosan gaming casinos, hotels and theme parks have been closed to the public. With the reduced number of visitors and tourists since March this year and the implementation of the national lockdown, Sokosan has had a heavy knock. They anticipate a loss in their growth for the year. The group, however, still expects to deliver a solid set of results regardless of the setback. In these desperate times, Sokosan is waiting for the proverbial sun to rise again so it can reopen to the public and definitely open for business. In the meantime, they have been approached to be one of the quarantine sites. Sokosan Hotel says it has been approached by both the public and private healthcare sectors to assist in the provision of quarantine facilities. As such, the Department of Health has identified and classified several quarantine facilities for national use. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Welcome back. Phumelela Gaming is a horse racing operator in the gaming and leisure industry, and it too has fallen to its knees and announced that it is on the brink of liquidation, and so it has filed for business rescue. Phumelela, whose name means, ironically, success, failed due to South Africa's COVID-19 lockdown restrictions, and it ran its course this week.
TANS, Phumelela is the country's largest horse racing group, and it's listed on the JSE. The company's leadership wrote a letter to staff saying that it was in urgent need of a capital injection, and it was filing for business rescue. Thousands of employees on its agriculture side and on the gaming and leisure side of the business are set to lose their jobs.
Among the many businesses that may not survive the coronavirus pandemic, listed companies are also at risk. South Africa's largest horse racing operator faces liquidation even if it gets a fresh injection of cash. The group is looking to raise capital as it battles for survival amidst the impact of COVID-19 epidemic. Now, Phumelela has lost almost 60% of its share value since the start of the year, valued at around 75 billion now. The company will need to decide if there is a prospect of survival. This after it reported an almost doubling of its loss in the first 6 months of the financial year to over 150 million. It has warned that at least 40,000 jobs are at risk with the lockdown having been extended into May. And now, to join us and to unpack more about the national horse racing industry, we are joined by the CEO of National Horse Racing Authority, V. Moodley. Welcome, V. How are you?
Thank you very much, Tendeka, for having me on the show. It's obviously not in a good news time, but it's an opportunity for me to try and empower people and state the position that horse racing finds itself in and where we are. So thank you.
Yes, these are trying times indeed, not just for human beings and human lives, but also for animals. I understand that over 60,000 jobs are at stake in the industry as a whole. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yes, Tendeka. Basically, just to start at the foundation of the business, the horse racing industry, the National Horse Racing Authority, we have a certificate to operate in terms of the Animal Improvement Act 1998, and we also registered Breeder Society March 2004. So currently at the moment, the National Horse Racing Authority is operating as an essential service provider, and we have our certificate from DAS, which is the Department of Agriculture, Farming and Fisheries. So to start at the foundation, we fit in multiple sectors, but the National Horse Racing Authority, mainly our role is from the agricultural sector. So that's where it started. So looking at that and looking at the entire supply chain, the direct jobs is 17,500 and indirect jobs and direct jobs total about 60,000. But Tendeka, when you extend that, I think the number is even much more than that. When you extend that, we're talking about 750,000 dependents. And what's very important, Tendeka, it's a critical part. This industry is unique, and most of the jobs in this industry is specialized skills.
Let me just recap for the viewers and listeners. This is an industry that straddles three key sectors. Am I wrong? It's gaming, it's entertainment, and it's agriculture.
You're 100% correct. Yes, agriculture, gaming, and hospitality.
Yes.
And it also expands. It also expands to additional economic multipliers such as infrastructure investment, crop growing, feed production, equipment. So it actually spans over multiple sectors. And yes, you're 100% correct.
Now tell us why this industry is in such distress. How does COVID exactly impact on the industry?
Tendeka, to be candid, the industry was under pressure prior to COVID. The other forms of gaming have taken over, and there's different types of bets that obviously interfered, in inverted commas, with the horse racing business.
Was this due to the increased regulation of gambling?
Yes. Obviously, that has happened. So the impact, where we see ourselves now, this has started years ago, and obviously the industry could sustain itself. But now with COVID-19, this was like the final nail, as I say, the harsh word, in the coffin.
Now, V, I was reading some of your documentation earlier in preparation for this program, and I was really heart-sore to learn about the plight of many horses. Potentially 400 horses a month would need to be euthanized if the lockdown proceeds into phase 3. And I'm just made to think of stories that I heard about the Great Depression, where people who had lost their farms would walk around the streets with their livestock. And when Africans lost their land in 1913, they would walk around the streets bereft with their cattle. Is the situation this dire? What's going to happen?
Tendeka, the situation is absolutely critical. So I cannot stress any further how bad it is. I actually am very emotional. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. And I once read a quote from Martin Luther King, and it has been resonating on me for the past 3 weeks. And I want to read that to you. And this is how desperate we are. It says, never be afraid to do what's right, especially if the well-being of a person and animal is at stake. Society's punishments are small in comparison to the wounds we inflict on our soul if we look the other way.
Wow, that's very moving and very evocative of the period we're in. But finally, you have applied to the South African authorities to be considered for some relief that would normally go to the agricultural sector. Can you just tell me briefly about that?
So Tendeka, yes. So we applied. We applied for the resumption of horse racing on the 1st of May. I think we have fulfilled and we have confirmed our surveillance protocols up to speed, is up to 100% correct. Just over the weekend, we had the Mayor of Johannesburg, the MCC for Health and Social, at our training center at Rankiesfontein. They tested 450 grooms, not one positive. The same has happened at Summerveld in Gold Circle. We've got 550 grooms, all negative. We are currently training these horses, feeding these horses, and caring for these horses. So our application went in on that basis that we've already raced behind locked doors from the 15th of March to the 27th of March successfully. We can do so again. Actually, every morning from 4 in the morning till 9:30, every training center around the country is caring for these horses on a daily basis. What we pleaded for is, please let us replicate what we do in the morning between 12 o'clock and 5 o'clock during the day.
Wow.
I need to summarize this. Sorry to take long. It's very important to understand. I am saying just 65 people to take care of a race meeting or a race event over a 5-hour period has the potential of saving 60,000 jobs and 750,000 dependents. And total event time is no more than 15 minutes per day. Surely that should be understood.
Thank you very much. V. Moodley, he is CEO of the National Horse Racing Authority of Southern Africa. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a small break. Now, welcome back. On the line, we are joined by Sherwin Gabriel, an economist and a researcher for Southern Africa. And he's working for an institute called Southern Africa Towards Inclusive Economic Development. Welcome, Sherwin Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Tandeka.
Now, Sherwin, I read your paper that you wrote with other researchers. Basically, you looked at the impact of the COVID virus on a number of industries in South Africa, and you made a number of conclusions. Can you highlight what the main 3 conclusions were in your paper?
Thank you, Pandita. Yes, so the SA Tide research was done in collaboration with the International Food Policy Research Institute, the National Treasury, the South African Reserve Bank, and UNU-WIDER. It sought to try and estimate what the impact is of COVID-19, particularly the lockdown. We find that the measures to contain the spread of COVID-19 are necessary, but these have very large economic impacts. We find that sectors, even ones that aren't locked down, show very large losses, which then lead to a decline in employment. So less skilled workers suffer relatively large losses in income than highly skilled workers. And the large decline in sales, imports, and income mean that tax revenue comes under significant pressure. We also take note that the economy won't immediately return to a state of the world that it was before the crisis. So using different scenarios of what we think the release of the lockdown could be, we estimate that the impact in 2020 could be a loss of between -5.4% and -16.1%, depending on how quickly economic activity can get back on its feet.
Now, I see in your paper that you make a distinction between the impact of COVID on educated workers versus low-level skilled workers and low-income households. Why do you make these distinctions? Is there a difference? I thought all jobs were under threat.
Indeed, all jobs are under pressure, however, some more so than others. So for certain types of occupations, one needs to really be at the factory to be able to operate machinery. But for some certain other occupations, there's a possibility of some flexibility in that some occupations can work from home. But also, we find that certain sectors that don't need to be locked down tend to employ a different profile of labor than others. So, for example, in your health services sector, you typically have more highly skilled workers, and that's allowed to continue. However, in certain types of retail or the need for drivers in certain types of transport and in the tourism sectors, the type of labor that you employ is quite different.
I noticed that you said in the paper that the highly skilled workers may have to take wage cuts, whereas it seems that the lower skilled workers may have to lose their jobs altogether.
This largely depends on how companies are able to, the kind of flexibility that companies have in response to the crisis. This largely depends on their financial, on their whether their finances can sustain that kind of activity. But indeed, it largely depends on how firms specifically react to this and whether they're able to keep staff on their books.
Now, I saw that you divided up the scenarios in terms of quick recovery, slow recovery, and so on, 3 basic categories. Could you share those with the listeners and the viewers?
Indeed. So in the quick recovery, we assume that the health system is able to manage the increase of COVID-19 infections. So this allows the economy to open up a bit more quickly. So under this scenario, we expect that the economy returns to about 80% capacity, or 80% of what it had been before COVID-19 lockdowns had been put in place. And these can go, and the assumptions range to more extreme ones in our long recovery scenario, where infections don't come under control, and we need to have social distancing and more restrictive movement for a longer time, in which we assume that economic activity is only around half of what it was before the lockdown.
Now, can you explain why your paper is so significant to policymakers and to ordinary South Africans?
I think that the approach in which we've looked at the impact of COVID-19 is quite deep. So we've assessed 4 ways in which COVID-19 is affecting the economy, namely the impact of the deliberate shutdown in industries, the effect of movement restrictions and closing of the purchasing of certain, all but the essential goods and services, and what this means for household spending, the impact of disrupted global supply chains and demand for South African exports, as well as what the uncertainty does to investment. So we look at this inside in a large detailed model that takes a look at how industries interact with each other, how they interact with labor, and how these translate into household income for different types of households in the country.
Now, if I were to say to you that policy shifts, grand policy shifts, often happen during crises, you can think about the many policy shifts in economics that happened around the time of the Great Depression. What do you think the key policy shifts will be around the COVID-19 depression?
I think that immediately the most important priority is to balance the health response against the economic consequences of the different choices. So it's important to make sure that you don't release the lockdowns too quickly, that your health system gets overwhelmed. But at the same time, you don't want to keep the economy suppressed, that it leads to other economic and health crises, such as an increase in hunger. Over the longer term, this is an opportunity to prepare the economy or prepare the foundation for recovery for when the pandemic abates. The government had already been considering different reform ideas, and it's important to be thinking about these to be able to create the platform for inclusive job creation and inclusive growth.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Sherwin. It makes one think of the Indian writer's work, Arundhati Roy, who says that COVID is best viewed as an arch through which we must go light and travel light and leave all our baggages behind and all our previous convictions and dogmas behind. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is Economics Unbound. Good night. Stay safe.